For thousands of years on one of the most unforgiving continents, Aboriginal Australians waged war without gunpowder, metal, or even the bow and arrow. And yet, they built some of the deadliest weapons ever made. This is not a story you've been told. Aboriginal warfare has long been dismissed as primitive. But those assumptions collapse the moment you look closer. Boomerangs could reportedly take a man's head clean off. Spears were engineered to cut through flesh like a chainsaw.
It will kill.
And colossal wooden swords unlike anything made on any other continent. Today, we're going to uncover the truth behind the weapons of Aboriginal Australia. We'll dig into the eyewitness accounts, recreate historically accurate weapons, and put them to the test against ballistics gel. Australian history and culture preserves one of humanity's rawest, most unfiltered expressions, and yet it has been almost entirely overlooked. This year, we will be covering all kinds of niche weapons and cultures. This is only the start of the best series on YouTube, so it is time to take a trip to the land down under. Australian history has largely been shaped by its geographic isolation. It has been cut off from the other continents since the time of the dinosaurs, leading to the evolution of utterly bizarre native species. Australia remained isolated from any hominid species until we arrived around 60,000 years ago. At this time, it was full of terrifying animals such as saber-toothed carnivores, massive dragons, and galloping crocodiles. But as the climate changed and these species gradually went extinct, our species endured, eventually dominating every region. Distinct cultures flourished around Australia throughout the Ice Age on par with anywhere else. But as foundational developments such as agriculture, animal husbandry, or ceramics spread throughout the other continents, Australia remained isolated. Ideas simply did not spread to the continent, and even if they did, Australia is huge, with very geographically distinct regions. The north of the continent almost touches Papua New Guinea, and bountiful rainforests can be found all along the east coast. The interior is mostly desert, making travel across the continent nearly impossible. Off the southern shore is also the island of Tasmania, culturally isolated for over 12,000 years. Despite the extreme isolation, humans are humans, and when we are left alone, we develop extremely complex and nuanced cultures. Most of the culture of Aboriginals was misunderstood by the European colonizers, but early anthropologists were blown away by not only the diversity of their cultures, but also their sophistication. As you will come to learn, the Aboriginal cultures of Australia are a treasure trove of human expression. They really just show humans at their rawest form. Like any other society, their culture often involved crafting devastating weapons to be used in warfare. And if you were under the impression that these weapons weren't very lethal, this historical account will erase that illusion. Previously, tribal feuds had been responsible for many murders among the blacks. When the Murrumbidgee and Lachlan blacks had met at any time, war between the two tribes always resulted, and they killed each other until one side gave in. During one of these battles, 2 blacks on the Murrumbidgee side were killed by one spear, which passed through the both of them. One also had his head taken off by a boomerang. This was the last fight between the Lachlan and Murrumbidgee blacks. Yeah, you heard that right, a boomerang decapitated a man. I want you to forget everything you've ever heard about this weapon. They aren't some gimmicky toy. They were heavy-duty weapons built to kill. 99% of boomerangs were not designed to fly back. Instead, they were made of incredibly hard wood, capable of breaking bones and cutting through flesh. They were most often used for hunting, while even larger and heavier examples were weapons of war. So we will be testing heavy-duty examples on this ballistics gel skull. But first, we have to learn what a boomerang even is. A boomerang is a form of throwing stick. As their name suggests, they are a projectile, and in fact one of the oldest in the world. Throwing sticks have been found dating back over 300,000 years ago, made by Neanderthals at the site of Schöningen in Germany. These weapons could be used to kill small game such as rabbits or birds. But a boomerang is a special kind of throwing stick, as it is wing-shaped and often recurved to cut through the air, improving power and accuracy. The oldest boomerang in the world dates back to 40,000 years ago and was actually discovered in Poland. It was carved from a piece of mammoth ivory, and it proves that this technology is extremely old and probably was once present all around the world. Boomerang technology may have spread into Australia with the first human inhabitants. By the time Europeans made it to Australia, this weapon was all over the place, and its effectiveness was astonishing. There were many different kinds of boomerangs. They were constructed from very hard woods that naturally grow around the continent. Woods such as mulga, black wattle, and ironwood are over twice as hard as oak. They would use naturally curved branches to make all kinds of terrifying weapons. The hooked number 7 boomerang had a particularly lethal reputation. It had 3 different striking edges. They could break through shields and even penetrate the skull. I am thrilled to test this out, but there are simpler designs that may prove more effective. Large wing-like boomerangs with sharpened edges were known to cut right through flesh like a blade. Considering they were made of extremely hard woods, I have no reason to doubt this. I decided to make a number 7 and wing-like boomerang, but there is a problem. I do not live in Australia, nor can I get my hands on entire branches of Australian hardwood, but I do have access to woods of similar hardness. I will be recreating several boomerangs based on the deadliest varieties I could find. They're not actually all that hard to make, but working with such hard wood is a new experience. There is, however, one big problem. I cannot make a number 7 boomerang unless I can find a board with wood grain that moves in this way. So unfortunately, I had to glue steel reinforcements into the striking head. Hopefully this holds up, or I'm sure the comment section will eat me alive. Despite the setbacks, the finished boomerangs are beautiful. The wood really looks great and these weapons are seriously hefty.
Now for what we've all been waiting for, boomerangs versus ballistics gel. These things are 99% accurate to a real human, and hopefully I'll be able to decapitate it with the large boomerang. This is gonna be crazy. All right, here we go. Oh no, I broke it right in half. Well, that was very unfortunate. My boomerang broke right in half and it didn't even hit the skull. Yeah, that stinks, but what can you do? We have a lot more boomerangs to try, fortunately. All right, this boomerang might break in half too, but it might also cut it, so let's try it out. Oh, just nicked it. I actually got him on the chin pretty good, but we got another one. All right, let's try it again. Oh, I broke that one. My boomerangs aren't holding up very well. Oh, I got him right in the neck. All right, that was enough playing around. Now for the number 7 boomerang. Honestly, I don't know which way you're supposed to throw it. I don't know if you throw it this way or this way, but I think it's gonna be deadly either way. Oh! I kind of knew this was gonna happen, but we broke the tip off the number 7, but we can still keep throwing it. Oh, look at that. Well, that was our first good throw of the day, and I think we completely destroyed his face. Look at this crack throughout his skull. Yeah, you'd definitely be dead if that hit you. His entire frontal bone right here is completely crushed. Just look at that. This jaw wound, I think, actually happened from that first boomerang, but this right here was new. This whole entire side of the face just got broken. It's 2 pieces. So even if it breaks, it's still deadly. All right, let's try the normal boomerang again. Oh, look at that. Ah. Oh, I took off his scalp. Well, that blow would have definitely knocked you out and probably killed you. It split the entire skull down the middle. Insane. All right, let's throw it straight on this time. Oh, God. Well, that was definitely a fatal blow. Just look at that. That would be his brain sticking out right there. All right, let's try to make his brains explode. Oh. I think we forget how deadly blunt force weapons are in the modern day. I mean, he was already probably dead at this point, but look at this. His cheekbone just fell out. Oh. Well, we finally got the blood to come out on that throw. Just look at that. Yeah, I think he's dead. I keep hitting it with the handle, so I'm gonna step a little farther back. Oh.
Well, boomerangs were definitely deadly. My boomerangs exploded and my technique was probably poor, but these were clearly still fatal blows. I imagine an actual Aboriginal warrior would have been 100 times deadlier than I am. So let's hear one more account about the lethality of boomerangs. This instrument is always thrown straight forwards, and if it hits the object at which it is aimed, the blow is very severe. YYN9 says that it will pass through the body of a man if the point strikes the softer parts. This account is interesting for a number of reasons, and after our tests, I do not doubt its ability to cleave through flesh and bone. But you may be wondering, what about returning boomerangs? While the vast majority of boomerangs did not return, some were designed to. They could be used to mimic hawks, to flush small game from cover, and others were used to hunt birds. But funny enough, just like today, most of the time returning boomerangs were just used for entertainment. Boomerangs were one of the most common weapons across Australia, but the club was the king of close quarters combat. An endless variety were made. Some were meant to break bone on impact, others had sharp blades to cut flesh, while many were also meant to be thrown. The most infamous was the Lil Lil. In form it resembles an axe. It has a long handle and then a fairly sharp blade. I fashioned mine out of ipe wood with a traditional blade featuring 2 points. If it strikes with either, it would cause horrible damage. One Aboriginal said, "If the ordinary boomerang may wound severely, may cause a contusion, or even break the arm if it strikes that limb, the Lil Lil forcibly and skillfully directed will break a leg, fracture the ribs, or even penetrate the skull." It's not hard to believe this when holding such a weapon, but its form has another benefit. Its curved design allows it to flow over a shield or parrying club and still deliver a fatal blow. For this reason, the Lil Lil was highly feared, as it could bypass the typically extraordinary defense of most warriors. And one archaeological find is a testament of just how deadly these weapons were. A skeleton from New South Wales was found to have devastating wounds all over his body. Chiefly among them were cuts to the front of the cranium. Other cuts were found on the skull, ribs, and other postcranial elements. The cuts look as if they were made by metal weapons. But this burial was radiocarbon dated to 600 years before Europeans arrived in the region. This caused researchers to consider that these wounds may have actually been made by Aboriginal wooden weapons. By closely looking at the dimensions of the cuts, they determined that the injuries were indeed caused by sharpened wooden weapons. The ability of them to cut right through bone is surprising, though ethnographic accounts do claim that they were smoothed to a fine edge and capable of cleaving through flesh. We are going to be testing this weapon out, but just like the last video where I gave away a maquawheat, I'm going to be giving away this Lil Lil club. Let's get this video to 100,000 likes, and I will be giving the Lil Lil away on my Instagram. All of the instructions are there. The next weapon we will be discussing is one of the most mundane, the wadi or the nula nula, a simple club often with a pointed end. It was used both as a close quarters melee weapon and also as a projectile. And while it is simple, do not underestimate its effectiveness. Let's hear from the diary of explorer Ludwig Leichhardt, who documented Aboriginal societies in the mid-1800s. On Mr. Rusden's station there was Susan, on whom old Jerry struck such a wound on the head with his nula nula that the brain was completely visible, and it is a miracle that this woman, who was pregnant, not only did not abort, but had recovered again in about 12 days. It is unbelievable how quickly their wounds heal. Even without much context, this quote is fascinating. A simple nula nula split open the skull with a single strike, and this woman was able to survive such a gruesome injury without modern medicine and incredibly fast. The nula nula is simple but effective, so I made one. But other clubs came in even more devastating forms, the most distinct being the liangle. It is characterized by a hooked L-shaped striking head. Even if this weapon was blocked, the point could still impact the enemy. This made it much harder to defend against, and the point itself could cut through flesh. For this reason, it was considered one of the most fearsome weapons. But next, the weapon I am most excited for. In the northern rainforests of Queensland, Aboriginals made massive sword-like clubs. These are truly some of the most unique weapons I have ever encountered. They often have impossibly small handles with massive blades. They range in size, but some examples can be as tall as a man. To make one, a large hardwood tree was cut down. A section as tall as a man was cut off and then split down the center. The form was then meticulously chipped off with stone tools, carving a small single-handed handle. The handle was then wound with bark fiber and coated in resin. The form of the sword depended on the form of the tree. Curved swords would be sharpened on one side like a saber, while straighter trees were sharpened on both sides. The blade was then coated in red ochre mixed with blood. These weapons have fascinated me for years. How were they used? How effective was their cutting edge? Well, of course I had to make one to find out. The resulting sword is truly a bizarre object. The edge is sharp and does really feel like it could cut. Anthropologist Walter Roth, who saw these weapons firsthand, assured that the edges were used for cutting. I am thrilled to test it out, but it is incredibly heavy and hard to balance. I am certainly not a world-class strongman, though neither were the people who use these swords. So let's look into some accounts of the use of these weapons. These swords were used with one hand stretched over the shoulder, with the sword hanging down the back. The sword was swung forward with a sudden jerk to strike the enemy. This technique works, but it is definitely awkward and predictable. They are so heavy that few white men can raise them at arm's length, and it is difficult to understand how they can be in any way an efficient weapon in the hands of the Australian savages. The strength required is almost certainly important to the function of this weapon. Violence is often just as much of a social performance as it is a means to resolving an issue. And in the case of the Rainforest swords, we know that they are often used in one-on-one duels. Duels often broke out when a girl had multiple competing suitors, a story as old as time. These duels were formalized and highly culturally significant. Here is a direct account. Now the duels were to begin. The shield is held in the left hand, and the sword perpendicularly in the right. But owing to the weight of the sword, it must be used almost like a blacksmith's sledgehammer in order to hit the shield of the opponent with full force. The combatant is therefore obliged to let the weapon rest in front on the ground a few moments before the duel begins, when he swings it back and passes his head against his opponent. When one of them has made his blow, it is his opponent's turn, and thus they exchange blows until one of them gets tired and gives up, or his shield is cloven, in which case he is regarded as unfit for the fight. The use of the one-handed swords was certainly a show of strength during duels, but they were also used in warfare where the stakes were life and death. Another possibly deadlier sword club was made all the way in South Australia. These clubs were two-handed with a much more practical design. The best example can be seen in this absolutely incredible image. A proud man is seen posing with his weapons and his woman. She is holding the sword club, and it looks like it can clearly be used with both hands and is a sturdy weapon. Obviously, I had to make one of these two-handed varieties. An account called these weapons katatwiris, and say they are a formidable weapon used exclusively for war.
I'm super excited to put this sword club to the test. As far as I know, this is the only time a sword club has ever been discussed on YouTube, let alone tested, so we're going to see how well this thing stacks up against this ballistics gel head. Remember, these ballistics gel heads are really tough, and the last time I tried to blow one up with a two-handed weapon was a macaw wheat, and it exploded my macaw wheat. But this right here is bloodwood, and it's over twice as hard as the wood that I used to make the macaw wheat. The edge on this thing feels like it could cut, and I think it could seriously cut into this skull. And guys, I finally have eye protection, so all you commenters better be happy now. Let's put on the chainmail just to be safe, though. Oh. All right, I think I'm ready to test this weapon out. Oh my goodness, look at this. There's blood everywhere, bits of bone, and look at his head. We split his skull right in half. That worked way better than I could have possibly imagined. Oh my gosh, look at this. His entire skull is just destroyed. And check this out, the wooden blade is mostly undamaged. Look at it, you can't even really tell where it hit. Definitely do not underestimate wooden weapons. I cannot get over how deadly that is. It's insane. Look at that pool of blood. That's the most damage I've ever done to one of those things. And I gotta hand it to the YouTube audience, because look at this right here. A speck of red dye would have went right into my eyeball if it wasn't for these glasses. And you know, as we say in the channel, safety third. But one thing's for sure, if you're an enemy of a guy wielding a sword club, you're not very safe. All right, that was amazing, but now let's try the single-handed club. All right, we're gonna be trying the technique that they say they used, so. Oh. Well, we broke what was remaining of his skull, but let's go again. Oh. Oh. Well, that was absolutely devastating. I think I kind of understand how these swords were used now. Well, it's kind of hard to tell, you know, what actually happened there because the skull is already so thoroughly destroyed. But it seems like it cut pretty well into the skull. And yeah, that was pretty brutal. Right now, I'm just praying to the algorithm gods that they don't demonetize this. All right, let's try out the Lee angle now that we've tested out pretty much everything. So it's got this sharp cutting edge on the inside and it's got a lot of mass to it. I think this is gonna be pretty deadly. We're gonna do two hands and just go like this. All right, this is gonna be pretty good. Oh, God. Oh. Well, that looks like something out of Stranger Things. I don't even quite know what I'm looking at. His brain is on the floor down there. And honestly, that was a bit of a cheap shot. I think we're just being rude at this point, so that's going to be the final test with these clubs. Well, that was absolutely insane, and I'm never going to underestimate wooden weapons ever again, and neither should you. When made out of a super hard wood like this, it's almost like metal. Honestly, it's so hard that the edge stays intact and just cuts through bone.
But now it is time to talk about spears, the most common weapon across Australia until the arrival of Europeans. Dozens of varieties were used. Many were simply thrown by hand, but in much of Australia, the spear thrower was used. This weapon is known in Australia as the woomera, and it is iconic to Aboriginal culture. The spear thrower was once used all over the world during the Ice Age, and there is evidence Mungo Man was using it in Australia over 40,000 years ago. In the Americas, the Aztecs used a similar weapon which they called the atlot. It works as a lever, allowing you to throw a spear faster and further. The Aboriginals made a wide variety depending on the region, but they were often concave. This allowed them to carry things in them. Many also had handles made of spare glue and even a stone glued into them to be used as a knife or chisel. They are truly ingenious tools. The spears or darts made for these weapons were often very long and flexible. No fletchings were used, as the flexibility and length stabilized the dart. The darts themselves and hand-thrown spears heavily varied, but there was a direct correlation with the complexity of a spear and its intended use in warfare or hunting. For hunting, they only cared to make weapons which caused large and deep wounds. But in warfare, they put all of their efforts into fashioning the most lethal weapons imaginable. Since their lives depended on it, they had to fly perfectly straight, and often be almost impossible to remove without causing extreme injury or death. Spear tips often featured barbs, so the tip could only be pushed further into the wound to be extracted. Though some spears use counter-directional barbs, so there was no way to push it, making it almost impossible to remove. Some spear tips used multiple components including poisoned stingray barbs and stone flakes. And that brings us to the deadliest Australian Aboriginal weapon, the death spear. It was a spear that was lined with small razor-sharp stone blades. When entering the body, these blades would lacerate flesh and create a wound that even modern medicine could not heal. The blades would break off in the wound channel along with bits of glue and wood. The resulting wound, if not immediately fatal, would without doubt lead to a fatal infection. These spears were used across various parts of Australia and were a technology used across the world as far back as the Ice Age. A 4,000-year-old skeleton found in Australia was found to have multiple small stone flakes embedded in his skeleton. The evidence suggests that death spears have been used across the continent for millennia. They are some of the most advanced and deadly stone tools you can create. And we know for a fact that these weapons killed many Aboriginals and European settlers. But now let's hear an account of just how deadly these weapons could be. Such a spear is thrown in such a way to produce a screw-like motion, by means of which it opens a passage through the body of its victim, circular in form, and in magnitude equal to the diameter formed by the longest barbs which the head of the instrument is armed. Indeed, I have seen it thrown as to pass entirely through a human body, leaving a perforation sufficient to admit a common-sized hand. One might be tempted to attribute such a statement to the tendency of the witness to exaggerate. However, it is confirmed by an English official who was a member of the First Fleet and who reported, in what is one of the oldest testimonies on Aboriginals, "On first setting foot in the country, we were inclined to hold the spears of the natives very cheap. Fatal experience has, however, convinced us that the wound inflicted by this weapon is not a trivial one. A spear had passed entirely through the thickest part of the body of one of the convicts, though a very robust man. It is almost unbelievable to hear the accounts of how effective these weapons would be in the hands of a skilled warrior. Other accounts affirm that these weapons cut like a saw, and they were powerful instruments of war. In order to test the true effectiveness of a death spear, I figured I had to make a few different varieties. Firstly, I made one that closely copied the real examples of illustrations of death spears. I chose a piece of chert, which I napped off small razor-sharp flakes. For the wooden shaft, I simply used a piece of hardwood and glued the flakes into the side. For another example, I napped a roughly made point and hafted it to the tip. Then I glued small sharp flakes all over the haft. Next, I made a hard wood blade and a more intricately carved wooden point with barbs. These were used in the north of the continent in the Tiwi Islands. Lastly, I just made the most brutal design I could think of based on illustrations. The finished foreshafts can be glued and sinewed onto a long shaft for throwing with a woomera or hand spear.
Alright, now it's time to test out these death spears on some ballistics gel. This is a ballistics gel organ block right here. It simulates flesh and there's even blood in there like a real organ. We're going to be throwing these death spears with the woomera to see how much damage we could do. Also, check out how long these spears are. They're almost as long as the ones that the old guys used to use. Please excuse the background. It's literally negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so I snuck into Home Depot to do this test. Alright, first we're throwing this barbed wooden spear that's like 10 feet long. Oh, I missed. Oh, we missed again. Oh. Alright, so that wasn't a perfect shot, but that would have sucked to get hit with. Look at these barbs are fully in the flesh, and it went in a good 5 inches or so. So let's try to pull it out. Oh my gosh, they're catching on the ballistics gel. It's not as like flesh because it's just a gel substance, but still, that would have been horrible to get stuck in you. Oh, look at that! Oh! Now that right there is something that you definitely don't want in your organs. I mean, it's just a wooden point, but man, hardwood is deadly. Oh, look at that, it's right in the organ. I mean, the barbs aren't in very bad, but oh man. Wow, that might have been deadly. I think it might have been, especially with infection or who knows. All right, enough playing around. It's time for the death spear. So this is the one that's on the thumbnail. See how deadly this is gonna be. Oh! Oh! Unfortunately, we didn't hit the organs and my dart broke in half, but it was a pretty good shot. I mean, look at all those little barbs in there in the flesh. Oh my gosh, I can't even pull it out. Those things are just gripping in there. So imagine having to get this out with Stone Age medicine, man. Brutal. Surprisingly, this stayed intact very, very well. Look at that. Yeah, that probably would have been a fatal wound if it hit you, you know, in your organ, ribs, even your leg, man. I don't know. And if you look at the wound channel, the projectile is way wider than it looks because the spear kind of moved around and cut as it moved because it's about 10 feet long, so it has so much leverage. And, you know, it might not be hand sized, but I can get about 4 fingers in there. Luckily, I made a lot of death spears in case any broke. Oh, look at that! Oh, look at that! Guys, the death spears are living up to their deadly reputation. I honestly cannot believe that shot. That is the best result I've ever gotten on one of these organ blocks. It literally almost penetrated to the other side of the block. And that's probably because it has such a long shaft, which gives it a lot of momentum when it hits the target. Just look at that right there. And that 10-foot long shaft also wiggled around, which would have cut you further, lacerated, broke off stones in the wound. Man, that's brutal. It will kill. And I'm sorry to the Home Depot janitor, because you're gonna have to clean that up. But now let's take it out. This is kind of hard. Oh my God. Look at those blades cutting their way out. Oh, we got like the membrane. That right there is a deadly weapon. All right, now it's time for this spear that we're throwing on a javelin. As usual, I'm gonna throw it pretty close because I don't want to miss, but let's see how deadly this is. Oh, gosh. Oh! How much blood is in this thing? Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think that would be fatal. Man, that janitor's gonna need a raise. It's called a death spear for a reason, y'all. That's the first time I've ever made it all the way through the other side of one of these ballistics gel blocks. And I've even tested these against metal spears. I am definitely glad I didn't have to fight against these weapons. That's like the atomic bomb of spears right there. And look at that exit wound. It literally cut a channel through it. You know, I don't think they were exaggerating. I really think this could make a fist-sized hole in you. Just look at that. I don't think a single land animal could survive this to the lungs. Well, it's time to pull it out. Let's see if we can even get it out. Look at that. Oh my God. Oh. And that's why they call it a death spear. That is absolutely gruesome.
Now it is time to discuss the stone tools of the Aboriginal Australians. In much of the continent, quality toolstone is absent, and flint is virtually non-existent. Tools were mainly made of chert and silkrete, stone that can be quite rough and hard to work compared to flint or obsidian. The best stone tools were made in the north, as quality stone was most abundant there. In Arnhem Land, long stone blades were taken off cores to make truly formidable tools. Known as Leilira blades, They often exceed 8 inches in length. It is hard to explain how difficult it is to create such a long blade of this form. I have not been able to replicate the form of these blades even with high-quality flint, but the resulting tools have 2 razor-sharp edges that converge into a horrifying point. By coating the end in glue or by attaching a handle, a strong and sturdy knife could be created. I am obsessed with the simplicity and functionality of these tools. They are some of the coolest stone tools I have ever come across, and that's saying something. These knives were often highly decorated and kept in feather sheaths. Others were used as devastating spearheads on the tips of woomera or hand-thrown spears. The most creative use was the fighting pick. A lailira point would be hafted horizontally to form a pickaxe-like weapon, undoubtedly a lethal weapon of war. And funny enough, there is a rock painting of a kangaroo attacking a man with a fighting pick. This could be the oldest meme ever made. We may never know. In the nearby Kimberley region, an entirely different approach to creating stone tools was developed. Instead of taking off long blades, cores of stone were nabbed on both sides to create a symmetrical serrated point. These are truly advanced stone tools, and the Aboriginals would often use glass obtained by Europeans to make them. At first, glass insulators for telegraph lines were stolen for their use as stone tools. This became a huge problem as these regions were very remote, and it would take days of travel to repair these lines. Some maintenance men began to leave extra insulators at the base of these poles so that they wouldn't destroy the actual line. When the white man finally began to migrate to the more remote regions of northern Australia, it was the brandy bottle that supplied the glass for these spearheads. In Central Australia, very unique stone tool traditions developed. The following information comes from the book Savage Life in Central Australia, 1924. The Wangkanguru people used stone knives for fighting. The Yuchawunta tool was a multi-tool used for everything from skinning animals, making cuts for scarification, and also for fighting. It would be held between the knuckles and used in duels. Another knife known as the Ilawunta or the fighting knife was also used for dueling. They were at least 6 inches or 15 centimeters long, with some exceeding 12 inches, and much like a lailira point, the blunt end was covered with glue. The knife was held downwards and used to slash. The point of the knife curved inwards, so that if it hooked into the skin, it would lacerate instead of just scratching. 2 warriors would go head-to-head with shields in one hand and their knives in the other. The goal was to slash the opponents above the knee. Some of these cuts could have been deadly as they were close to the femoral artery, but the goal of these duels was ceremonial, and a mediator was always present to stop the fight if it got out of hand. These knives were never used in warfare as of course they would be outmatched by any longer weapon. But how fascinating is it that less than 100 years ago, stone knives were still regularly being used for duels in this region. Another implement used commonly in the central deserts was the circumcision knife. Circumcision has to be one of the weirdest cultural practices. It has been practiced by numerous cultures unconnected with one another. Most might attribute the practice with Judaism, but in reality, it was widespread in traditional cultures across Africa, Asia, and Australia. The origins of this practice must go far back into antiquity. It is possible that our species developed this practice before leaving Africa over 70,000 years ago. This would explain the presence of this procedure in Australia, and there is evidence of circumcision in Ice Age art from both Europe and Australia. But why do people elect to do a dangerous mutilation on vulnerable children? Well, it varies by culture and practice. In Australia, it was often part of intricate coming-to-age rituals. Australian Aboriginal cultures absolutely loved elaborate and esoteric rituals. They would involve costumes, dances, songs, and importantly, secretive information about the universe and tribal history. These ceremonies could last for days, often until the women got tired of bringing the men food and rebelled. Of these ceremonies, the coming-of-age rituals were some of the most important. Boys had more or less the same status as women, but after this ceremony, they became men. Building up to their circumcision, the boy learns all of the tribal laws and taboos. The procedure in this case was done with a sharp stone flake, but other tribes occasionally used sharp shells. The pain must have been absolutely traumatic. Savage Life in Central Australia says, "The feelings of the person operated on are not considered in any way. It does not seem to matter to the old men how much they hurt the other fellow, and the young men consider it a disgrace to show any feeling. The pain endured during the circumcision proves their strength and worthiness to learn the deeper secrets of the ancestral knowledge." Though this practice sounds barbaric, this is likely what circumcision looked like all over the world at one point, and likely what the traditions of Judaism and other cultures descend from. Not all tribes in Australia practiced circumcision. It was mainly present in the central deserts, but it was documented spreading out around the continent. To me, circumcision is one of the most interesting anthropological topics. It is an ancient mutilation ritual still almost universally practiced in the United States despite any real medical purpose. Alright, enough circumcision talk. There are more stone tools to talk about. Stone ground axes were used in many parts of Australia. These tools were sometimes nabbed into shape and then ground smooth. Others were just ground. They were mainly for felling trees and general woodworking. It is possible that they were occasionally used as weapons, but heavy wooden clubs were preferred by most tribes that used stone axes. But in Western Australia, one of the most unique tools was used, the coge. It was made by attaching a big ball of glue to the end of a stick, and then a sharp stone was glued into one end, and a flat stone was glued into the other. It certainly could kill a man with a single blow, and even the stick side was sharpened in order to stab enemies. It was a true multi-tool. I decided I was going to make a Lylira fighting pick, but first I had to flint knap a point. I also figured this would be a good time to do a little cameo.
Hey, it's Hank Schrader here. You made it too far in the video without liking and subscribing, okay? This guy, North 02, he knows way more about minerals than Marie. That's for sure. Anyway, you better like and most importantly subscribe for some serious ancient knowledge. And don't break bad.
So now let's try out the Lylira pick on this ballistics gel. That had absolutely no problem penetrating through flesh right there. That would have been a fatal wound for sure. Oh, God. I don't think any of you are surprised that this weapon is absolutely deadly. Let's just take this out real quick. Oh. Yeah, that is a super deadly weapon, man. I've always suspected like Neanderthals or even ancient Homo sapiens would have used weapons like this. Like, it's just so intuitively deadly. I mean, it's a pick. This can go right into your skull, into your bones. You could even use it for hunting or something. Super, super deadly weapon right here, and nobody really hears about them. All right, next we're going to be trying out the circumcision knife. I'm just kidding. I hope. Back to the video.
Melee and ranged weapons were very important to warfare in Australia. But there was another third type of weapon that was just as, or even more important, sorcery. In modern society, we might laugh off such superstitions, but to the people of Australia, their world was full of spirits, curses, and magic. Australian Aboriginal religion was based on animism, the world's oldest religious practice. In animism, everything has an inherent spiritual essence. Every animal, rock, mountain, and gust of wind are interconnected and imbued with life. This is what characterized the Aboriginal belief system, sometimes referred to as the dream time, but that term only applies to a specific tribe to my understanding. Without diving into the topic too much, the point is that to the Aboriginal Australians, their world was filled to the brim with spiritual meaning and strict cultural laws. Their worldview also allowed for the proliferation of superstition and supernatural abilities such as sorcery. Direct efforts and rituals were performed in order to harm enemies and to protect family. The pointing bone was a perfect example of this. This weapon was used to point at a distant enemy. If successful, the enemy would get sick and die. But like any superstitious ritual, perfect preparation had to be done or else it would fail. Basically a built-in excuse for when it didn't work. But another form of sorcery was directly deadly and far more terrifying. Kadaichi shoes were footwear made out of feathers. These shoes allowed you to travel silently at night and leave little evidence behind. They were used to sneak into enemy camps at night, kill a man, and leave silently. This must have been terrifying. Everyone in the camp would wake up to one of their own seemingly killed by a ghost. These were truly psychological weapons. Another such weapon was the strangling cord. It was a sharp implement made from the bone of a dead man. A very strong cord made of kangaroo sinew was attached to its base. This cord had a loop at its end so it could be pulled tight. A medicine man would sneak into an enemy camp at night and wrap the cord around his neck and pass it through the loop. He would then pull it tight and strangle the man unconscious. His feet would also be bound and he would be carried off to a secluded spot. The medicine man would then use the sharp end of the bone to cut into the man's abdomen. He would then spin around the bone, collecting the so-called kidney fat. The medicine man would then return him to his camp. The next day, the victim might assume he had a bad dream, but in a matter of days, he would be dead. This is absolutely horrifying. It's like getting abducted by aliens, but instead of a sanitary spaceship, some guy steals your so-called kidney fat, which kills you. It is likely that the kidney fat is actually the greater omentum, a fold in the peritoneum full of fat, blood vessels, and immune cells. This is equivalent to the caul fat of animals that is often used to wrap meats. The removal of these structures from the abdomen would certainly cause infection and possibly death, all with barely leaving a mark on your abdomen. What a terrifying way to go out. Perhaps this helps you understand why Aboriginals were so superstitious, because there were actual magic men prowling around in the night coming after your kidney fat. Now I want to cover a few oddities that are not weapons but still fascinating. The Kurnai tribe of Australia would wear mummified human hands as necklaces. But these weren't just for show. They were enemy warning systems. One was worn on the chest and on the back. If an enemy was sneaking up from behind, the hand would scratch the back. And if in front, the chest hand scratched. Now they probably didn't actually do this, but it is still extremely cool. Another oddity were wooden chisels for tooth avulsion. These simple tools were used to knock out teeth. The two front teeth were often knocked out to signify a boy becoming a man. This practice is at least 40,000 years old, as Mungo Man was found to have his lower canines removed. This practice of mutilation reminds me of circumcision, especially considering it was a painful part of a boy becoming a man. Another strange tool were skull drinking vessels. Tribes in the southeast would use the skulls of their own relatives to carry water and drink from. This is a perfect example of what is so fascinating about not only Aboriginal Australia, but anthropology in general. These people carried around the skulls of their loved ones as water bottles and thought nothing of it, while it would be horrifying to see any of our loved ones treated this way. It goes to show you just how relative human culture can be. And another oddity you have almost certainly never heard of are Australian mummies. That's right, in 5 geographically isolated regions, human corpses were dried and smoked to preserve them. They would be carried from camp to camp and placed near the fire to observe tribal dances. Some included the removal of the skin, perhaps why some Australian tribes thought upon the arrival of Europeans that they were actually seeing their dead ancestors coming back to life. And next I want to talk about some cool things about the Australian Aboriginals themselves. Do you know some of them have naturally blonde hair? And researchers found that it is caused by a completely separate mutation than the one that Europeans have. Along the Kimberley coast, some populations were also exceptionally tall. Individuals standing 7 feet tall were reported. A famous photo from the 1920s documented 2 Aboriginal men from Western Australia standing 6'7" and 6'5". Apparently a lot of these populations were devastated by diseases and mostly disappeared. In the rainforests of the east and regions in the south, people tended to be much shorter than this. So yeah, people varied a lot throughout the continent. Some of the populations there have been isolated from each other for tens of thousands of years. Okay, now that we have talked on and on about Aboriginal material culture, let's talk more about actual violence and warfare in Australia. First of all, it is important to note that most Aboriginal groups were based on the family and averaged around 25 people. This is pretty much the worldwide average group size before agriculture. These bands had a defined territory for hunting and foraging. They were attached to larger tribes or nations which spoke the same language and shared members. At the time of European arrival, there were at least 600 tribes and 250 distinct languages. This consisted of hundreds of thousands to possibly over 1 million people. Most all lived traditional hunter-gatherer lives. Males generally hunted large game while the females hunted small animals and gathered. Some may have engaged in cultivation of wild plants and built semi-permanent shelters, though agriculture was absent. Some regions were rich in resources and had surprisingly dense populations, while isolated areas could be devoid of human life altogether. One of the most interesting regions had to be Tasmania. They had been separated from the mainland for about 12,000 years. As a result, they only had about a quarter of the tools that were present on the mainland. They are a fascinating topic for another video. Overall, it is important to understand that massive wars of conquest or the formation of organized armies really wasn't possible. At the end of the day, food had to be constantly foraged, and group sizes were generally small. But this didn't stop brutal conflicts from occurring. War often stemmed from rights to women. Naturally, when someone was killed, revenge killing immediately occurred, spurring on never-ending violence. Violence often occurred due to sorcery accusations as well as marriage disputes commonly fought over in duels, but larger battles were also common. Two lines would advance, throwing spears and boomerangs first, then coming into close combat with clubs. Ambushes and nighttime raids were also a feature of Aboriginal warfare. Here is an account about one of these horrifying raids. Assailants stole upon the sleepers and thrust a spear deeply into the abdomen, and as he awoke and ran, blows from bundis and waddies were showered upon him and another spear hurled into his side. It is hard to imagine how you could get a good night of sleep in Australia back then, but I don't want you to get the impression that violence only consisted of petty ambushes. War was often planned and heavily prepared for, so let's hear another account. A native camp preparing for battle was a beehive of industry. Even the children had duties to perform. The men had to burn wilgi for their body decorations, prepare new spear sticks, and attend to their other weapons. The women busied themselves chipping flakes of stone for their spears and kneading gum. The new spears had to be greased and the old ones re-greased, a duty which generally fell upon the boys. The battle seldom occurred before a week or more of preparation. This shows just how similar warfare was to other historical societies such as the Greeks or Gauls. War has undoubtedly been a serious formalized practice in our species since time immemorial. And now let's hear about one of the largest battles I have come across in Aboriginal Australia. Edward Steffens documented a battle which occurred on the Adelaide Plains of South Australia. His account goes as follows. If the reader can imagine 300 or 400 warriors on each side in their panoply of glorious war, marching in line with shields as depicted, and the quivering spear uplifted high, he will admit that war, even among the Aboriginal Australians, has its serious aspect. The signal for battle was given, and outshot from both sides a volley of spears, the sharp-pointed ones used in hunting large game. These were neatly caught on the shields. Imagine 700 or 800 painted savages with painted shields, yelling like demons and hurling at each other 800 waddies, all on an area of less than an acre. The waddies were thrown with amazing rapidity. Some met in mid-air and went up like a pair of newer married skyrockets. Those that came home to the object aimed at were parried by the shields, and going over the contestants' heads, they glittered in the sun like a shower of 20-inch icicles. Falling in the rear, they were secured by the women and children, then handed to their fighting husbands or fathers as the case might be. Sometimes a waddy would be received obliquely on the shield, which was otherwise held upright. The result was it would glance against the head or face of the right or left-hand man. Should it hit the head, no evil would follow, as the thickness of the skull was an unfailing safeguard against concussion of the brain. But should it unfortunately find its way to the region of the stomach, then followed a fearfully explosive grunt, a sudden collapse, and a speedy retirement to the rear. These events tended to break the order and discipline which, up until this point, had been very well sustained. This account is extremely interesting. I would have doubted the ability of traditional foragers to organize such large fighting forces if not for documentation. But regardless of the size of a battle, many men across Australia died in war, and many more were left with brutal injuries. Injuries which had to be cared for with Stone Age medicinal practices. Thousands of years of warfare caused the people of Australia not only to develop fairly effective medicinal practices, but also to become extremely durable people. As we heard about earlier, a woman's brain was visible after a hit from a club and she lived and delivered a healthy baby. There are dozens of accounts of Aboriginal people surviving terrible wounds. A man named Rudecindo Salvado reported that in Western Australia, an injury inflicted by an ordinary spear was seen by Aboriginals as of little importance, having only pierced the thigh to the bone, or crossed through from side to side. Besides the pure toughness of these people, they also had a wide variety of medicinal practices. Large cuts were stuffed with charcoal or clay and sewn together. Broken limbs were set in splints made of bark, clay, and kangaroo sinew. There were also many superstitious healing practices involving sorcery and other strange procedures. Next, I want to tell you about the colonization of Australia. Like the Americas, Africas, or any other land and people subjected to colonialism, it was absolutely brutal and heartbreaking. Not many people have heard of just how bad it was in Australia. Massacres, disease, land theft, and re-education institutions utterly devastated Australia's Indigenous people. But in many cases, they were far from passive actors. And I will tell you a story about one of Australia's most legendary figures, a man who stood up to colonialism and fought with an unbreakable spirit. The area of Sydney has been occupied by Australian Aboriginals for over 50,000 years. It is a fertile land abundant in natural resources, and many cultures flourished here. Of course, the British decided to turn this wonderful land into a prison colony. In 1788, more than 1,000 settlers arrived, over 700 of them being convicts. They pushed out the Aboriginal inhabitants through violence and established a permanent self-sufficient colony. However, many of the colonists suffered from poor health, and crop failures led to food crises. Many also died in skirmishes with Aboriginals, who would raid farms and burn crops in retaliation. The British feared that Aboriginal warriors held the capacity to destroy the weak settlement. That was until smallpox ravaged the indigenous people, killing 50 to 90% of their population. But the survivors banded together to continue the resistance. The muskets of the colonists were deadly, but the Aboriginals developed effective tactics. They would dance and taunt the colonists into firing their guns, which had a slow reloading speed. They would then throw their spears and effectively ambush the colonists in close combat. The most famous resistance fighter of the so-called Sydney Wars was Pemulwuy. He was born with a distinct birth effect in his left eye where it was permanently turned. During the 1790s, Pemulwuy led countless guerrilla attacks against settlers and their farms. He would burn down their huts and crops and kill their livestock. The most well-documented of these attacks came on December 10th of 1790. On this day, John McIntyre, the governor's personal gamekeeper, was on a hunting expedition deep into the bush. They were resting for the day when McIntyre heard a noise and saw 4 Aboriginal men crawling towards them. "Don't be afraid, I know them," said McIntyre, who spoke to the man in their own language, asking them to stop and offering them bread. McIntyre believed Pemulwuy had been in Sydney because he was clean-shaven and had short hair. As the gamekeeper put down his gun, Pemulwuy stood on a log, fixed a spear in his woomera, and threw it. "I am a dead man," cried McIntyre. The jagged spearhead penetrated deep into McIntyre's body, perforating his lung. When he extracted the spearhead, Surgeon John White found that it was barbed with small pieces of red stone. The friendly Aboriginals who were part of the hunting party knew immediately that the wound was fatal, for he was mortally wounded by a death spear. The reason for the attack is unknown, but multiple bands hated McIntyre since he hunted many animals with his musket, and even was said to have shot Aboriginals. On his deathbed, he did admit to shooting at least one Aboriginal man. It is no surprise Pemulwuy would kill a man directly destroying his country. A revenge party of 50 Marines was sent after Pemulwuy, but they would not find him. He continued to raid colonists and burn crops. In 1785, Pemulwuy and his warriors attacked a work party which contained an African man named John Black Caesar. He was one of the first settlers of African descent, and he was said to have been massive. In the battle, he managed to crack Pemulwuy's skull, knocking him unconscious and presumably dead. But he recovered and continued his resistance. 2 years later, he and his warriors killed 2 settlers, prompting a force of British soldiers to pursue Pemulwuy. They tracked him and his band of 100 and surprised them. They attempted to peacefully seize Pemulwuy, but he threw a spear in protest, causing the soldiers to open fire. The firepower was overwhelming. 5 warriors died instantly, and Pemulwuy was shot 7 times. The broken and bleeding man was taken into custody and locked up at a hospital where his wounds were treated. He had an iron on his leg and buckshot in his head. All must have seemed lost. But the cunning Pemulwuy managed to escape through a window with his leg iron still attached. He made it all the way back to his people and continued his resistance. To his people, he became a legend, thought to be invincible to firearms. He continued to raid with his warriors, but his injuries did limit his combat abilities. According to Darug man Uncle Richard Green, with simple spears, rocks, boomerangs, and stones, Pemulwuy defeated the British army that they sent here. Every single soldier except Watkin Tench that they sent in pursuit of Pemulwuy either walked back into the community with their saddle over their shoulders, or they didn't make it back. Resistance continued for another decade until 1797, when he reached reconciliation with Governor John Hunter. Hunter recognized him as a leader for his people, and agreed not to punish him. But 4 years later, another governor named Philip Gidley King ordered Pemulwuy to be brought in dead or alive since he was accused of killing 2 men. The next year after that, he was shot and killed. He apparently did not fear bullets, and his time finally came. The colonists seized his body, decapitated him, and placed his head in a jar to be sent back to Britain. It was accompanied with a letter from the governor who wrote, "Although a terrible pest to the colony, he was a brave and independent character." As far as anyone knows, his head remains somewhere in the Natural History Museum of London. Repatriation of Pemulwuy has been requested by Sydney's Aboriginal people, and Prince William announced he would return it in 2010. They apparently have no record of the skull, though there are reportedly 3,000 remains of Aboriginal people in storage in the UK. Hopefully, one day his remains will be located and returned to his homeland. Pemulwuy is just such a fascinating character, and I felt his story deserved to be told. The weapons of the Australian Aboriginals are absolutely fascinating. What they were able to create with only components from their native lands is beyond impressive. These weapons are just so utterly unique, and I had such fun time researching, recreating, and testing all these weapons. All this year I'm going to cover cultures and weapons you've never heard of. You better subscribe right now, because you aren't going to want to miss a video. 2026, we're not just hitting 1 million subs, we're hitting 2 million. Join now. Alright, thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss out on another upload. I'll see you in the next one. Arrivederci.